Maya Rivera had learned to move as if she were invisible. The corridors of the Argent Crest, an edifice of Venetian marble and temperamental chandeliers, were her stage and her camouflage. At dawn, she polished brass door plaques to a mirror sheen. At dusk, she smoothed sheets until they sighed. Between those hours, she became the silent custodian of other people's secrets. Her life was measured in the small economies of tips and overtime, in the quiet arithmetic of medicine refills and overdue rent. Every gesture she made, every deliberate hush, was for Noah, her younger brother, whose cough kept them both awake and whose need turned ordinary exhaustion into necessity. That morning had been another one of those endless shifts. Her palms smarted from detergents that smelled of citrus and bleach. Her feet remembered the pattern of carpets in a dozen suites. When she pushed open Suite 2401, Julian Vale's penthouse, though she did not linger on the name, she expected the same ritual. Inspect, replace, remove, ignore. The bed lay like a small, forbidden island of white silk and down. Maya had never meant to sink into it. She had only bent to fold a comforter, to arrange a scattering of hotel-supplied rose petals, to catch her breath for one ordinary breath. The mattress welcomed her as if it were an ally, and exhaustion folded her shoulders into sleep. When the door shut with the decisive click that heralded a storm, Maya woke as if the world had flipped. There was a man at the foot of the bed who might have been carved from an old marble statue. Tall, severe, and unexpectedly domestic in the way his robe hung from his shoulders. Julian Vale's eyes were not merely blue. They were a kind of unblinking sky that catalogued everything it regarded. For a moment she saw him as a judge, for another as an intruder with the authority to unmake her. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice low, a tone accustomed to issuing verdicts. It felt like a charge. Trespass, insolence, the crime of belonging to a world he had not sanctioned. Maya's pulse was an animal. She rose quickly, her fingers fumbling at the hem of her uniform as if the fabric itself might explain the trespass. She began, and found herself suspended between truth and fear. "I was cleaning. I sat down for a second." The words were small and human, imbued less with pleading than with the worn-out script of someone who'd rehearsed apologies into survival. Julian's brow tightened, and for the first time a small trace of curiosity softened the hardness of his features. He had become a figure of whispered headlines. Shrewd investor, private philanthropist, the sort of man whose luggage bore a concierge's instinct for order. He did not dismiss mistakes lightly. Yet when the flush on Maya's cheeks and the rawness in her voice registered, something like wonder flickered. He did not fire her. He told her to leave. But the universe is sly. The memory of her, in his suite, curled like a small secret, took root. Julian found that his attention betrayed him all day. His meetings blurred together. His calendar became a blur of small irrelevancies compared to the imprint of a tired woman's silhouette on a king-sized bed. There was humor in the injustice. A man who had everything, distracted by someone who had almost nothing but a resolute dignity. Maya, for her part, did not know she had been observed. She carried on, a woman who carved out privacy amid the public idleness of the hotel staff's lounge. She treated her tiredness like armor, and the chance glance of an owner's heir, if that was what Julian was, did not tempt her to dream. Dreams were luxury. She had a brother and a ledger of bills that had never learned to be generous. When Julian passed her the next morning in a fluorescent corridor, the sight of her arranging towels made him feel something unstable and human. She avoided his gaze. She moved quickly with the economy of a person who must always be gone before they are seen. He was used to people performing for him, to the subtle currency of flattery and fear. Maya's sobriety, her refusal to be rendered as entertainment, intrigued him like a new language. "Tell me about yourself," he surprised himself by saying. She blinked as if he had spoken into a different century. "Why would my life interest you?" she asked. And the deflection was a shield he respected. He pressed, Nonetheless, and in the quiet that followed, he began to learn about bone-deep responsibility, about a younger brother with a persistent cough, and about a woman who painted small skies on the backs of receipts in moments she could steal. Julian did not know where the sudden, foolish tenderness came from, whether it was pity or fascination or the nascent tenderness of a man who had briefly glimpsed a landscape he had not deserved to own. He resolved, quietly and dangerously, that he would see her again. That resolution unspooled the first thread of an unforeseen tapestry. Not merely a meeting of two people from opposite sides of a city's ledger, but the beginning of a story where a single accidental nap could become a fulcrum that tilted two lives toward each other, and towards something neither had believed they could claim. Julian Vale had never been a man of whimsy. His world was graph paper neatness, acquisitions, schedules, reputation, each plotted with the ruthless fidelity of a cartographer. Yet the morning he requested that suite 2401 be assigned to Maya for cleaning, the request arrived in the staff rota like an earthquake. It was an act without precedent in the Argent Crest's history of delegated cleanliness. Owners did not dictate which employee touched which linens. That his voice had carried the authority to reshape routine did not, in his mind, cancel out the peculiarity of the impulse. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was atonement for having seen her asleep on his bed. Both statements were true, and both hid what sat under them. An impatience, a vulnerability toward what was genuine. Maya walked into his suite on the morning he chose to be there. The scene was so plain it might have been comic if not for its charged quiet. Julian, in a robe, propped by a mid-century chair, sipping coffee as if he had always staged mornings this vulnerable. She froze on the threshold, caught between professional decorum and the intrusive intimacy of being observed mid-task. "You'd rather clean someone else's room?" he asked, coolness teasing the joke from his tone. Maya placed a stack of towels on the cart with the simplicity of a practiced gesture. "I do my job," she replied. "I didn't sign up for anything else." There was an amusement in Julian the world rarely permitted. The softening at corners reserved fard for family, not for those who made it to the headlines. He studied her. There were calluses on her hands that bespoke unremarked labor. There was a neatness to how she held herself, a private dignity that refused to be garnished with celebrities' attention. He began to see the person behind the uniform, an artist with a stack of charcoal sketches hidden beneath a mattress in a one-bedroom apartment. A woman who rationed the electricity to keep a paint lamp low and alive. Days turned into repeated encounters. Julian orchestrated them like a composer coaxing a refrain. A requested assignment here, a chance bridge of conversation there. The more he learned, the less he could abide the idea that fate mattered more than choice. He purchased a set of painting supplies, an ostensibly generous gesture to the staff's lounge that was secretly labeled and intended. When Maya later found the brushes stacked in a cardboard box with a small, anonymous note, she suspected clerical charity, not the intention behind the gift. Yet he was not only benevolence in a tailored coat. The truth was sharper. Something in Julian recoiled at the easy ways the world accepted inequality. Perhaps it was a guardian's guilt, perhaps a curiosity about the rawness of a life outside boardroom gloss. He began to intercept small injustices, a requisition for overtime that would leave her short of a necessary payment, an argument over schedule that would have left her stranded for a week. He paid them quietly, like a man who preferred to fix things rather than explain why they broke. Maya, however, remained wary. She had learned to read motives like weather. Sometimes storms promised cold rain, sometimes they brought spring. Julian's attention frightened her. People like him had ways of changing others that felt like erasure. Gifts could be a currency for ownership. Affection could become the rubric by which a woman's autonomy was redefined. She excused herself from small offers, lunches, rides home, sheltering from commitment like a bird under a tin roof. There was a night when the city wrapped itself in a sheet of cold rain, and Maya stepped out into it without an umbrella, her uniform plastered to her like a confession. Julian's car pulled up as if conjured by fate. He did not hover with the grandiosity of a benefactor. He opened his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The scent was cedar, and something unfathomably like winter. It was not the perfume of a man used to being adored. It was something closer to the scent of a man seeking to be forgiven by life. "Get in," he said. Her first instinct was to refuse. There were rules about what a maid accepted from a guest. But the cold was a more persuasive authority. She accepted the coat and boarded his car, the leather seat a little too soft, the ride a little too silent. In that quiet conversation yielded fragments. He learned finally that she painted to breathe, that the sky she painted was not the sky she could afford. She learned that beneath his trophies of success there resided a man who had been taught to command, and who now, confusingly, wanted to be known. Their proximity did not inaugurate romance, not then. Rather, it created a fragile vocabulary, small kindnesses, shared silences, the exchange of truths that were practical and private. Yet where Julian grew audacious with gratitude, Maya's mistrust hardened. She clutched her autonomy like an instrument she could not afford to break. She had known too many hands reaching across power, hands that offered a quick fix and then a trap. The argent crest hummed on, oblivious to the soft revolution unspooling in its back corridors. Two lives were moving toward a precipice on which everything could be remade, or everything could fracture. Julian felt a hunger to protect. Maya felt an obligation to keep her heart intact. Between their impulses, there hung a silence waiting to be tested. Maya had a ritual she believed in like a contraband prayer. After shifts that tunneled into the small hours, she returned to her cramped apartment with its single window that framed a sliver of the city's crooked skyline. In that window, the light pooled like a promise she could never quite reach. She would change into clothes softer than the polyester of her uniform, lay out a scrap of canvas or the back of a supermarket receipt, and let color do the translating her voice could not afford. Her paintings were modest, small arcs of cobalt and ochre, skies that leaned toward the infinite despite the smallness of their support. They were not made for galleries or applause. They were made to remember a possibility that had no bank balance to validate it. When she sketched, the room stopped being only a residence and became a room of commerce-free dreaming. Noah would cough in the next room. The weight of his breath would be an accountant tally. But for a few stolen hours, she was allowed to be only an artist. One afternoon, exhausted after an extended shift, she left a sketchbook open in the staff lounge, a slip of paper that felt like a confession. Julian found it as if luck had favored his curiosity. He turned the pages with the reverence of a man who had discovered an unknown language. Ink met oil pastel, sky met memory, and he read the small, unadvertised atlas of her imagination. He cradled the pages like contraband. When she walked into the lounge and saw him there, fingers tracing a horizon she had painted, her heart leapt and dropped in the same motion. She snatched the book from his hands, wrapped it around her chest like a child defending a secret toy. "It's nothing," she lied, because nothing was safe. The lie hung between them like thin glass. "It's not nothing," Julian said, and his voice had the tone of someone who had been wrong about many things and intended not to be again. Their conversation was not melodramatic. He did not kneel to declare life-altering devotion. Instead, he asked about pigments, about the way she mixed ultramarine with a dab of warm brown to make a twilight that didn't belong on a pay stub. She watched him with a wariness that was part pride and part survival instinct. People gave her things and expected gratitude. Julian's interest felt like an invitation to be seen rather than a ledger item to be accounted for. There was a small, extraordinary moment that did more to shift their axis than any speech. Julian returned a week later with a plain cardboard box tucked under his arm. He placed it on the staff table as if presenting a gift to a friend. Inside were tubes of paint, a new pad of heavyweight paper, brushes with bristles that promised clean lines. The note tucked inside read simply, "Use them for the sky." Maya traced the letters and felt a tremor of emotions she could not name. Generosity, yes, but also the suspicion of theatricality. She refused the urge to ask why, and at first she refused the supplies outright. People like Julian made grand gestures for their own comfort. The commodification of generosity had been her experience. Yet in the quiet that followed, she found herself opening the box in private, touching the bristles like a sacrament. She painted that night as if the city needed a new sky. Word of it traveled, of course. In places like the Argent Crest, nothing remained small for long. Julian's assistant noticed the oddness of his boss's interests. Other staff noticed the slight improvement in supplies in the lounge and assumed corporate philanthropy had changed direction. Complex things have a way of unraveling into gossip. Maya, meanwhile, felt something she had not felt since childhood when her mother would leave a jar of jam on the table. A permission she had never expected. The paint was not merely material. It was a vote that someone believed she might become something more than survival. Noah's cough receded that week by the smallest measure, and she told herself the change was unrelated. The truth was vaguer. Hope is mischievous and sometimes feeds on small mercies until it becomes a habit. Julian watched her with the intensity of someone who feared loss. Each new brushstroke she made was like a ledger entry, debiting him of patience and crediting him with a dangerous tenderness. He began to imagine a life where her work was not hidden on receipt backs, but framed on walls. The thought was both wonderfully arrogant and simply selfish. He wanted to see her succeed because her success would mean he had not been wrong for caring. And yet both of them kept their distance, like two musicians learning a duet. Their exchanges were full of warmth but hesitant phrasing. They stood in the periphery of one another's lives, testing the limits of proximity. He feared intrusion. She feared ownership. Between strokes of paint and moments of impossible silence, an unvoiced possibility grew. Perhaps a sky could be bought, not with money, but with attention, and perhaps attention could be transformative if it wanted the other person's flourishing rather than their indebtedness. The small studio of her life had changed its gravity. The painting supplies became both a bridge and a barometer. With each new horizon she rendered, Maya found herself whispering to a future that had once seemed unattainable. Julian watched as someone who had rediscovered a hunger to correct wrong impressions he had made of the world. The city blurred beyond their windows, but between them the air shimmered with unspent possibility. Julian Vale had been schooled in the art of getting what he wanted, a specialized education in leverage and timing, in the alchemy of optics and influence. Yet when he invited Maya to dinner in the private dining room of the Argent Crest, it was not strategy that moved him. He wanted to learn the grammar of her laughter. He wanted, in the bluntest possible sense, to be someone who could occupy the same small human spaces as she did. The invitation arrived as a seemingly ordinary request. He appeared in the corridor and said, "Dinner with me tonight," the words soft as a dare. Maya's reaction was an architecture of instinct, bewilderment edged with resolve. She declined. The refusal was not theatrical. It was practical, a boundary drawn with steadiness. "What would people say?" she asked. "What would it look like?" Julian heard the concern for appearances and the fear of being branded a charity case. He had seen wealth become a weapon, used to quiet dissent or disguise poor intentions. He knew all the ways power could be misread and misused, so he said plainly, "I don't want to pity you." Maya's defenses did not immediately lower. She had watched men of money perform kindness as if it were a tax write-off. She had seen smiles that dissolved when an unpaid bill arrived. The world had taught her that acceptance could cost one's dignity. She had been schooled in caution by necessity. To accept Julian's benevolence felt like letting a hand decide the terms of her life. The standoff crystallized something bigger. Two different freight trains of experience hurtling toward each other. For Julian, this was an education in humility. For Maya, it was a test of identity. Would she allow herself to be more than the person memory tracked as maid? The city around them throbbed with indifferent opulence, charity galas, closed-door negotiations, the kind of philanthropy that required photographers. In contrast, their exchange was intimate and ugly and beautiful because it involved risks neither could entirely afford. Then the wedge appeared. Celeste Harrow. She was the kind of woman born into consequence, with a necklace of expectations that glittered nearly as brightly as the diamonds draped on her throat. Celeste had been orbiting Julian for months, her life a careful choreography of proximity and advantage. She knew how to use a table setting, how to place her laughter just where it would intrigue. To her, Maya was not a person but a variable, an element in a design she intended to control. Celeste's smile was a surgical instrument. One afternoon she approached Maya in the staff lounge with a checkbook so deliberate it might as well have been a blade. She offered a sum large enough to make anyone's ledger breathe easier, and she suggested with the sweetest cruelty that Maya accept it and walk away, leave Julian before he left her. "Better to be offered a safe berth," Celeste said, the words slick as oil. The implication was obvious. Take the money. And be quiet. In the world Celeste represented, fortunes were prefabricated solutions for social discomfort. Maya was furious. The check lay between them like an insult. She did not want charity. She wanted choice. She batted the offer away, literally, as if it burned, and refused both the money and the insinuation that she might be bought to solve another woman's insecurity. Her reprisal was quiet and dignified. Celeste's face, usually untouched by humiliation, flamed with something like ire. But fate has a sense of theater. When Julian walked into that lounge only a moment later, he saw what looked like Maya accepting the check. The tableau was engineered for misunderstanding. A woman with a check in hand, another watching with a sculpted smile. Julian's vision narrowed. The world that made him so efficient at dismissing pain now supplied a cruelty of its own. He believed the image rather than the truth. Betrayal, once suspected, is a corrosive thing. Julian's voice was brittle as an old coin as he confronted Maya. He accused with a coolness that was less about anger than abandonment. "I trusted you to be different," he said, the judgment compact and final. Maya tried to explain, but the scene had already leapt from suspicion to certainty. Words that might have served as explanation tangled themselves into excuses. The brief, bright thread of trust between them snapped. She quit the Argent Crest that day. She left with her sketchbook, her brushes wrapped in a towel, and a suitcase heavy with the weight of decisions made under duress. It was not merely a resignation, it was an act of self-preservation. Julian watched her go, the hallway swallowing the last of her silhouette, and the hotel, ornate and unrepentant, felt like a stage set emptied of its protagonist. For Maya, leaving was an assertion. She would not be someone's footnote or an emotional convenience. She did not expect the absence would tear through Julian with the force of remorse. Yet it did. His rage at himself for believing a staged lie gored him with a kind of grief he had not known he owned. At night, the suite felt like a borrowed room. He had not only lost access to a woman, he had lost a clarity that revealed him to himself. As for Celeste, she kept her victory, like a trophy. But trophies rust. The truth is not always tidy, and the human heart rarely obeys the logic of social maneuvering. In the aftermath, the city continued to glitter, unaware of the small moral earthquake that had shifted 2 lives out of line. People like Julian were seldom acquainted with the solitude that follows a chastised pride. People like Maya had not planned for entanglement, yet both found their private maps rewritten. Julian Vale's life had been built on control. The control of markets, of image, of the neat, geometric consequences of choices. Losing Maya had taught him the intangible cost of error. He tried to reclaim the narrative by immersing himself in impulse, but to throw money at a problem was to mistake currency for contrition. The ledger of his conscience began to balance toward an uneasy debt he could not reconcile with boardroom rationality. The discovery came not from a whispered apology, but from a mundane object that shifted the axis of truth, a recording. Oliver, Julian's assistant, thrust a file across his boss's desk like a confession. The audio was small at first. Footsteps, the rustle of fabric, and then the honeyed tone of Celeste's voice, instructing a subterfuge that would place a check in plain sight at the moment Julian walked into the staff lounge. The voice that followed was Maya's, honest and irritated and very human. "I don't want your money." Then the setup, the snap of a trap. The evidence was irrefutable. Julian ran. The city that had previously been a polished stage became a maze. Streets doubled, rain blurred signs, neon lights melted into smeared confessions. When he found Maya's apartment building, the stairwell smelled of old paint and the kind of loneliness that sits in the corners of doorways. His knocks were a series of staccato demands. At first, there was silence. He imagined the worst, that he had missed his chance, that she had boarded a bus, that the gulf between them had been filled with other towns, other lives. The door opened, not with theatrics, but with the same ordinary hesitation Maya had practiced all her life. She stood framed in a doorway that was recognizably only hers, a place nobody in Julian's world had bothered to notice. She had a suitcase by the couch, as if the city's indifference had finally been chiseled into a decision. Her eyes registered shock, then the remnants of a pain Julian had not intended to cause. "Please," he said, the word a raw thing. It was not the polished language of his contracts. It was a plea. "I was wrong." For a long moment she said nothing. The air between them tasted like the rain that had started to fall again, like an old wound reopening. She was not indifferent. She was guarded. To be forgiven was one thing. To be loved was another. "I thought you betrayed me," he confessed. "I thought you took a check that wasn't yours." Maya's memory of Celeste's smile was a small, hot thing. She could have left. She had been ready to walk away from the entire hotel economy with her head held high. Instead, she had prepared to leave because she would not be complicit in rewritten narratives. Her voice, when it came, was not immediate acceptance. It was a cautious accounting. "You believed her," she said. "You believed a performance. I didn't need a man to save me. I left because I wanted to be honorable, to myself." That precision of intent struck him like a blow. He realized his error had been not only trust misplaced, but a failure to listen. Feeling contrite was only the first line of a longer ledger. What followed was more difficult: admission and action. He did not ask her to come back as an employee. He did not offer a grand apology dressed in corporate philanthropy. He simply spoke the words that had eluded him since the first night she slept in his suite. "I love you," he said, and the confession was heavy with the awkwardness of truth finally realized. Maya's response was not immediate surrender. Her life had not been composed of such declarations. It had been composed of decisions. She listened to him, to his stuttering, to the way his hands were not gestures of a man used to begging, but an inventory of vulnerability. The rain outside shaped their conversation into a ritual of weather, torrents that washed, then cleared. When she stepped into his arms, it was not the culmination of a single utterance. It was an accumulation of moments, his small attentions, his genuine attempts to correct wrongs, the way his presence had begun to change the architecture of her nights. They kissed in a way that resolved not all of the past, but enough of it to allow the future to be imagined. It was not a fairy tale consummation. It was a human reconciliation, tender and a little chaotic. Julian did not use power that night to coerce or to redeem. Instead, he used it to repair. He found someone to help Noah directly, medical consultations, funds for better care, without spectacle. He insisted on supporting Maya's art on its own terms, not as a trophy in his lobby. He used influence quietly, like a craftsman restoring an old painting, not erasing its texture but preserving it. The press eventually learned there had been a misunderstanding because such stories insist on tidy summations. But the real repairs were not press-friendly. They were quiet. A studio painted with sunlight leased under a name that belonged to Maya. A private visit from a doctor who made Noah laugh in a way strangers rarely did. Afternoons when Julian, an entrepreneur used to profit and loss, learned the strange mathematics of patience. They built a life that was neither perfect nor predictable, but one where apologies were not the end, but the beginning of better accounts. The rain that had once seemed like punishment became a kind of cleansing. Julian and Maya learned, almost painfully, that love requires labor as much as it requires feeling, and that the currency of a relationship is not only the depth of its emotion but the humility with which those involved tend the wounds they cause one another. Months later, on the rooftop of the Argent Crest, where the city stretched like an audience below, Maya stood amid canvases that resonated with the light she had always painted into them. The studio Julian had rented for her was modest by gallery standards, but vast by her own reckoning. High windows, a paint-splattered floor, and a wall where sky after sky leaned into one another with the casual insistence of someone who had finally been given space to breathe. The opening of her first small exhibition brought a thrum of nervousness she had never felt before, written over in a different kind of expectation. The crowd that gathered was not merely there to praise a billionaire's latest benevolence. They came for the honesty of color, for the way her horizons held weather both tender and storming, for the way each piece declared, without apology, that the human heart could stretch beyond the arithmetic of scarcity. Julian stood somewhere in the periphery, not as a man to be credited on the plaque, but as someone who had learned how to be part of another's scaffolding without taking its credit. He watched as patrons murmured over a painting that depicted a skyline with a small, improbable opening of light, a detail that had been in the first sketch he had seen. Maya moved through the crowd with a poise that looked effortless because she had earned it. Years of waking early, of paying for medicine, of choosing dignity over expedience. When she approached Julian, the exchange was brief and spare. There were no grand pronouncements, only the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had weathered rumor, jealousy, and their own fragile egos. "You got your sky," she said, and there was gratitude in the assertion that was not indebted. It was mutual celebration. "And you got your heart back," he replied, with a rueful smile. He had learned that love does not absolve responsibility, but expands it. He had become a man who tended rather than possessed, who used wealth as an instrument for care rather than control. The gallery was not the end of their story, but a waypoint, proof that a life reconstructed could be made of art and bad coffee and the small rituals of keeping a promise. Their story did not become a moral everyone could agree on. The press wrote its shallow versions, of course, minefields of glitz, a billionaire and his improbable artist. But Maya had invested her own labor into the narrative. She had not been merely rescued, she had become co-author. Noah, recovered to a steadier rhythm, walked in the gallery that night. He was not background, but a living presence who had been gifted with stability that did not erase the past, but made room for a future. They loved in the messy, particular world human beings always inhabit, with lingering doubts, occasional missteps, and a fierce fidelity to the small tasks that keep a life functioning, remembering appointments, paying bills, showing up. Julian learned to listen before he acted. Maya learned to accept help without surrendering agency. In that compromise, they discovered a version of partnership that suited them. One in which power was shared, not surrendered, in which generosity was paired with respect. The city beyond the gallery continued to tilt toward its usual dramas, its towers of capital and its subterranean economies. But for the people who mattered in that small orbit, the stakes were different. A woman who had once hidden her art on receipt backs now hung canvases where strangers could stand before them and be moved. A man who had once collected empires now collected small acts of care that could not be traded. They stood together beneath the lights, ordinary and extraordinary at once, and the sky, painted and real, arched above them, patient and broad enough to hold every mistake and every redemption they could muster. If the story has a lesson, it is not neat or prepackaged. It is simply this. Lives change by constellations of small decisions, by apologies that are matched with reparations, and by love practiced as a craft rather than performed as a spectacle. Maya and Julian did not inhabit a fairy tale. They inhabited a messy humanity that, when tended with humility, could make room for beauty.